I don't know if you heard, but my Lush Life cocktail tours of Soho are thrilling the masses. Check out lushlifecocktailtours.com for more information. But rest assured, on each tour, you'll be introduced to some of the most famous bars and bartenders in London, all while sipping their celebrated cocktails and learning about Soho's drinking history. You can find tickets on the website lushlifecocktailtours.com. Don't miss this sophisticated romp through Soho. Hope to see you there. Now let's get on with the show. Our guest today is rewriting the English dictionary. No longer will "it's just small beer" mean something unimportant. From now on, small beer means just that, small beer. I'm Susan Schwartz, your drinking companion, and this is Lush Life Podcast. Every week, we are inspired to live life one cocktail at a time by the best in the industry. Felix James, co-founder of Small Beer Brew Company here in London, gave me a history lesson on small beer, a lower ABV version of beer that was drunk by most men, women, and children alike as early as Chaucer and Shakespeare's time. Water could kill you then, so small beer it was. Even George Washington had his own recipe. One day after work, Felix longed for a great beer that wouldn't leave him unable to drive home. This thought kept repeating itself until he and his partner decided it was time to fill that gap in the market and create their own. Now, how does this fit into Season 4 of the Classic Collection? Well, if Chaucer and Shakespeare were drinking it, then it's a classic in my book.
Absolutely. So I actually grew up in Shropshire, which is in the West Midlands. And it is fairly close to the Welsh border, and I actually spent a lot of my family, my sort of childhood, my family moments sort of in Wales, which is a beautiful place. And then, but at a very early age, so at the age of 9, I moved to Berlin with my mother, and lived in Berlin for 7 years, and then I moved to New York.
Wait, so how old were you when you were in Berlin?
So from the age of 9 to 16.
So just starting to be beer drinking years.
Yeah, absolutely. And the fabulous thing about Germany is that you're allowed to drink beer when you're 16. They have a very, very sort of healthy relationship with alcohol, I think, where it is accepted, and this is sort of, I think this is kind of, maybe applies to the whole of the continent, is that beer is something that isn't just kind of consumed to get drunk. It's something that people enjoy, and it's sort of it's woven into the fabric of life. And so in Germany, it's very much a given that when you're 16 years old, you're allowed to buy beer, you're allowed to drink beer, you can do whatever you like with beer, but you can't drink anything stronger than 10%. So effectively, it puts you out of drinking strong wine and spirits, which I think is quite clever.
Do you remember drinking beer then?
Absolutely. I remember, my first experience drinking beer was in France on holiday as with my dad, and I was 4 or 5 years old, and I had a little sip of his beer, and that actually has provided inspiration, I think, to why we now bottle our beer in little stubby bottles. So they're still the same volume as other long neck bottles, but they just have this, for me, this kind of nostalgic appeal where we think as Brits that stubby bottles mean continental beer, and so that to me just means holiday. It means having fun, enjoying yourself, being in the sun, drinking a nice cold, refreshing beer.
So you moved from a country that thinks drinking beer at 16 is fine to the USA.
Exactly, yeah.
Where you can't carry around a bottle.
I probably consumed more beer in the USA than I did in Germany, in 40-ounce bottles. And I spent my 2 years there between the ages of 16 and 18 constantly with black crosses all over my hands from trying to spend as much time in bars as possible, and then.
So you must have looked older, or you had a fake ID, obviously.
No, I just. So you're allowed in as long as you're not drinking, and as long as you have a black cross in your hand. But then, I used to hang out with my sister's friends, so
the older sister, obviously.
So that's it.
And they said, just give them a beer.
Yeah.
So after the US, did you come back to
I did,
the UK?
yeah. So I came back to the UK and with the sole intention of going to university, but also, so I studied biology. And during that time, I was also very much sort of heavily involved in food in London. And so I was working at Borough Market.
At 18?
Selling food. Yeah.
So young.
Yeah. And I was also cooking food in Shoreditch in a little shop. And so...
Plus going to school at the same time?
Yeah. It was a pretty full-on week, actually. I had sort of Monday to Friday at university, and then Saturday I was working at Borough Market, and Sunday in the shop. So it was this kind of full-on lifestyle, which I don't think I've ever let go of. I keep saying to myself, one day, there will be a moment where I stand still for a bit, but it's not for now.
Now, when you were working, did you have to work on the weekends, or was this something that you really wanted to do? Both?
It was supplementing the income, but it was it was pretty much a necessity. But it was also something that I loved. I mean, it was...
Because you could have done anything and you chose to work
absolutely in food. I mean, food is just, it is so important for our lives. And I think it's important for us to understand that 100 years ago, 80% of our income would have gone on food. Mm-hmm. And now, these days, it's less than 10%. And at the time, I think the quality of food just wasn't quite appreciated as it is today, and there's been certainly a renaissance in eating, and there's been a renaissance in drinks, and I think that's kind of paved the way and allowed us now to set up what we have done here at Small Beer.
Do you think your love of, or your wish to work with food came from living in different countries and eating different things, or did you have a family who loved to cook?
Yeah, I guess so. I actually spent the couple of years that I was in New York, I spent very, very close to food. Living on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, you almost can't get away from it. And my mother, actually, both of my parents are architects, so my mother had spent a lot of time away from home, traveling. And so I was kind of left on my own, and she taught me. My parents used to run a restaurant before I was born, and so she taught me some very simple dishes to kind of look after myself while she was gone. And so that was, it was a huge passion of mine, cooking food, but then also getting into making these sort of fermented things that you could start and then you could leave and you could come back to and find what had happened. It was a scientific appreciation for food, and so. I remember at the age of 4 or 5 again making little yeast cultures in milk bottles and putting balloons over the top of the milk bottle and seeing the balloon being blown up by the carbon dioxide being produced, and that just fascinated me. And so kind of translating that into actually taking home cabbages from the market and chopping them up and making them into sauerkraut,
which you would have had, of course, in Germany. Right.
Totally, yeah, absolutely. And so that was but it was such an amazing process that you could just take one vegetable, add salt. I mean, it is by far the easiest recipe, the simplest recipe. There are only 2 ingredients, cabbage and salt. And yet so much happens as a result of that. I mean, the salt pulls the water out, the water allows this perfect aqueous environment for these bacteria to take hold, and then all of a sudden you've got this kind of lactic fermentation. Who would have thought? And that, in a way, shows me, the simplicity of that gives me confidence in the fact that, now I understand how beer was made so many thousands of years ago. When people always say, who thought of actually putting all these ingredients together and boiling them up and going through this whole mashing process? I mean, it's very involved, but actually, the simplicity of fermentation is just that you leave something until it starts fermenting, and then some fermentations taste better than others. So
did that lead you to biology, you think?
So I was definitely food was definitely it was a fundamental part of me understanding biology, and I think my very first real understanding that I would have a life being a biologist was when I was sort of 13, 14 years old in Berlin. again, learning about the kind of gastrointestinal tract and the way that we consume food and what happens in nutrition was extremely important to me. And I think, when you learn about the calorific content of food and the way that we process food and metabolize it and assimilate it into our bodies, that was fascinating to me as well. So it's kind of, I guess it was always a scientific appreciation for food that I enjoyed, and those two things, food and science, come together so beautifully with beer, because you can approach brewing like a chef. You can basically spend the time in your kitchen developing new recipes, and you can think of it just as a combination of flavors. But at some stage, you're going to also have to appreciate that in order to get somewhere that you want to go, you have to use the scientific method, or at least for me, that's the only way that I've found that you can really achieve success in brewing, is to really get behind the science of it.
So did you, with this biology degree in hand, did you go right into brewing?
I was. It was before I had the degree in hand. It was certainly. It was. I mean, literally from the outset, from my first couple of days of university, I was brewing at home. I was home brewing throughout university. So I had actually found this mad video of these couple of guys in Northwest Arkansas brewing up a 6-pack of beer. And I just didn't believe that you could make a 6-pack of beer. I mean, to me, beer was something that was made on a mass scale in these huge factories. Nobody ever saw. It was all behind closed doors. And all of a sudden, they had allowed me to find out that actually it was something that everybody can do. And so it was, a matter of days. I bought all the raw materials and I just started brewing literally on my hob in the kitchen. Made a small batch, my first homebrewed batch of beer, which was a beautiful Belgian beer, and luckily it went right, because that just immediately spurred me on, and I thought,
I love that you got it right the first time.
Well, I did. My second batch wasn't quite. I mean, maybe
you're like, this is easy.
Maybe it was beginner's luck. But then since then, I've realised that there are so many things that you really, you do need to get right, and so it's just been it's been an appreciation for brewing. I never quite saw myself just being a brewer. It was just a part of this kind of world of fermented foods. And I still, in my free time, I love to spend time cooking and making food and making cocktails and appreciating flavor and building. So I built a pizza oven, and I love to spend time with my family on the weekends making pizza and other things in the pizza oven, beautiful steaks and all sorts of things.
So you graduated.
Yes.
And did you think that the drinks industry was calling
absolutely
you?
not. I had this vision of setting up a warehouse of food, and in my I think in order to do that, I knew that I needed some funds, and so I latched onto a job which I found completely by mistake, which was at a brewery, and I didn't even know which brewery it was. And at the time, I had in my mind that it might be some beautiful little microbrewery. It was just around the time that sort of the very first microbreweries were popping up in London. And it turned out to be Anheuser-Busch, who make Budweiser. So
how could you get that so wrong?
It was it was just through an agent. I mean, I heard from some people gossiping in the library at university. They were talking about a job in a brewery, and they said, it's ridiculous. Who would want a job in a brewery? And I stuck my head in and went, me! I want a job in a brewery. So, and it turned out
the biggest brewery in the world.
It just happened to be the biggest brewery in the world. Exactly. So, but that was fantastic. Actually, I didn't know my luck at the time, because working for Anheuser-Busch, they had such a dedication to quality and to that scientific method, to really genuinely making things as consistently. I mean, okay, some people might not like the taste of Budweiser, they think it's bland, but hey, you know what, it's consistently bland. And it doesn't matter actually what you're producing if you use that amount of. They always said at the time that they were the most expensive beer to brew, and somehow, I can't quite put that together in terms of the raw materials that they used and everything, but the amount of effort that they put in, and the laboratory functions, and all the quality control and everything was just
well, when you open a bottle,
yeah,
it better taste the same every time.
Every single time.
Yeah.
And so that gave me actually from progressing from Anheuser-Busch, and I've worked for sort of smaller and smaller businesses, I now understand this balance in business between, what the big guys do, which is kind of getting it right. Because, hey, after all, they're the guys that have survived, for a long time and grown up to be what they are. And so they didn't do that from doing things wrong. I mean, they're certainly getting something right. Versus the smaller businesses that can be more nimble, and that have a better, where as a single person in that business, you can have a much better understanding of the entire business as a whole. In a bigger business, sometimes, particularly if you're lower down, you kind of feel like you're never going to understand the entire business. Right. And so there's this balance. I think I'm very happy that I've worked in both bigger and smaller businesses, but I think moving down from bigger to smaller has been the best way to do it, because then you can take what you've learned in those bigger businesses, use that kind of structure as a tool to understand what you're going towards. And that's not to say that we will be the next Anheuser-Busch. I think there are other ways of doing things. Right. But no, I think we certainly apply that rigor to everything that we do here, which I think has stood us in good stead.
Of course. Now, you said you worked for some smaller. You've been going down in scale.
Yeah. So from
after that Anheuser-Busch experience,
Anheuser-Busch was actually so in 2008 they were taken over by 2009 they were taken over by InBev, and so AB InBev is now the biggest sort of beer conglomerate in the world. So they turned from a sort of family-run business into part of this much bigger machine. And I left the business shortly afterwards, and I just hopped across the river from Mortlake near Richmond up to Fuller's Brewery in Chiswick. And so I worked at Fuller's, which is this amazing regional brewery, London-based brewery with this very rich history. They've been going for 174 years, and they were just bought out actually by Asahi around Christmas time. But they were at the time still very much a sort of family-run traditional brewery, and just making that step, it was a big step in terms of culture, in terms of that sort of scientific approach and everything. Everything became a little bit more rounded, a little bit more. I sort of felt like I was part of the historical process rather than just the scientific process. But it was it was a big learning for me.
So what were you doing for them?
So that allowed me to really jump up in terms of the kind of up the managerial chain, and so the majority of the time that I was there, I was actually working in production, but on the packaging side. So running the bottling line, running the keg and cask lines, and managing that sort of packaging process of the beer. But that again is, people think of brewing as just as work production, as basically producing this unfermented beer, but the packaging beer is by far the most difficult part of the entire process. And so that as well just gave me a wonderful understanding and foundation, and now allows me to understand very, very closely what I need to know, and how whether I can trust people to then take the beer that we produce today and put that into package. Which it doesn't sound very glamorous, but it is absolutely crucial. I mean, it's there's no point in making a great beer if you then if it ends up not tasting so great once it's got into a bottle or into a keg, it's gone to a pub, it's been served. It has to taste perfect when whoever is drinking it drinks it. That's the key. And so it doesn't matter how much love you put in at the beginning, there's always the potential for that to be completely destroyed And so for us, that is crucial that, we understand that full kind of life cycle of that beer.
Well, working at one of these big companies and starting your own is a huge leap.
Yeah, very, very, very different.
When did you feel the passion to say, okay, I think I'm going to do my own thing?
So I think throughout that entire process, when you're, when I joined Anheuser-Busch, I was excited, I was young, I was still sort of nimble in my mind enough to kind of think, well, I could start a business any moment. And it certainly was always an intention of mine that at some stage I would start a business. Now, once I moved on to Fuller's, I started jumping up the chain. All of a sudden there was salary and there were bonuses and there were, I had a car and a mortgage and a family. I got married quite young and I've now got 2 kids. And it was just inconceivable then at that time that I would be able to jump out of of this stable situation into something so daring as to set up a brewery. But it was I actually moved from Fuller's. So after 5.5 years at Fuller's, I moved just down the road to a distillery, to Sipsmith. And that is where I met my business partner, James. And we used to go to the pub together and enjoy some beers after work. You work in a distillery all day. It's all about gin. That's the whole thing. Well, you get down to the pub, the first thing that you want is a beer. So we...
Were you ever tempted to just stay in the spirit world, as we say?
Oh, it's very tempting. Spirits is not just because I love spirits, and I do actually. I really gained a huge appreciation for spirits. I remember when I first got the job at Sipsmith, I had probably I'd drunk gin maybe 5 times in my entire life. It wasn't even just wasn't something that I'd really touched upon at all. And it was more the lure of this incredible job, working at the top of a small business as the head of operations within Sipsmith. It was just this incredible opportunity that lured me in. But I remember speaking to Fairfax, one of the founders, on the phone. He said, "Congratulations, you got the job. Go and celebrate. Go and have a martini." And I kind of came off the phone and I was like, what's he on about?
What have I done?
What's a martini? What is this all about?
Did you ever feel that you had abandoned beer?
Why would I go and have a martini? Absolutely, yeah. No. I feel
oh my God,
actually,
I'm going to step into a different world.
Completely. And I still feel the same about the two, is that if we wanted to make money as a business, if we wanted global success, if we wanted it all to be, easy and straightforward and wonderful, we'd have stuck in we'd have stayed in the world of spirits. Beer is just madness. It is completely nuts. You really, really have to know what you're doing with beer. It's technically very, very difficult to make good beer, even at 4 or 5% alcohol.
I was saying that to all the spirit lovers. It is very difficult to make a good spirit well. Not everyone can make a bathtub gin. I don't mean as in your bathtub, not the brand of bathtub.
Sure.
Sorry.
You keep telling yourself that. That's
right.
No, it is difficult.
Avoid the trolls.
It's difficult until you get into the world of beer, and then you realize really how difficult it is. But it's a no. I'm simplifying.
We are teasing.
But it was beer. I did feel like I'd given up on beer, and I felt bad actually, and I always appreciated going back to Fuller's and seeing my friends there and actually understanding the hardships that they were in, and they saw me in this sort of high up world on my gin on my gin mountain, but it's no actually being at Sipsmith taught me other things. Taught me a lot about running a small business. Being so close to the top of the business, you really, really understood actually how businesses certainly at that stage of their life cycle. I mean, Sipsmith, when I joined Sipsmith, it was just 5 years old as a business, and businesses are really, it's not just all about money and sort of going to work in a suit. It can be exciting, and you can work within this really close-knit team. It's almost like taking on a new family, and developing a culture and developing a brand and what that means. I think before then, my understanding of business was very much, well, this is the world of operations, and the marketing people are these airy-fairy people who have no understanding of really what we do. And Sipsmith really taught me, even though I have a background in operations, I know now that that a drinks brand is nothing without the brand itself. Mm-hmm. And because it doesn't matter how good your liquid is, whether you're making beer or gin or wine or whatever, it can be the very, very best in the world, and yet if nobody knows that it exists, then that's such a shame.
Or the story of it.
Absolutely.
That's why we're here talking to you. There's this story behind small beer.
Yeah.
And that makes you choose the small beer as opposed to any other beer out there, because you know the story.
Yeah.
They've heard this, hopefully, or it's definitely part of the story. There are 800 gins out there. Why does someone choose one over the other? It's the story of the gin, absolutely.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. And so I think that was something where, at that stage, I'd almost lost the ability to think about setting up a new business. Mm-hmm. Until this point where James and I sat in a pub, and actually even before we sat down, we're looking at the pump clips, and subconsciously we're both thinking the same thing that I think a lot of people are thinking when they walk into a pub. You know what, I really, really want a beer, but what I don't want is all the effects that come after that. So whether I'm going home to my family, I want to spend some time, some quality time with them, I want to have dinner with them, whether I have to get up early the next morning to present to the boss, whether I am the boss, whether it's, there are so many reasons why you shouldn't drink alcohol. And yet, all you want is a beer. How hard can it be? Does it really have to be this sort of this frustration, this sort of this trouble every time you go to the bar, and you're just so for us, I didn't want to be drinking non-alcoholic beer. I didn't want to be sat there with a lime cordial. It was the whole process, the experience of drinking a beer is so wonderful. You get the immediate refreshment, the aroma of the hops. It's such a beautiful, delicate experience. And it can bring back memories. We know that our senses, and particularly our smell, is so closely associated with our memories and mm-hmm. with pleasure and with joy, and with so many of our emotions. And so I yearn for that experience, and yet what I don't yearn for is all the nonsense that then follows. And non-alcoholic beer just wasn't an option for us for two reasons. One was that it didn't provide any of that sort of slightly, the alcohol gives you, it just takes the edge off a little bit, allows you to kind of sit back, socialize, and sometimes you need that mental capacity in order to come up with those eureka moments. Mm-hmm. If you're constantly just running on this treadmill your entire life, you never quite step back and look at everything, and then you don't realize what's right in front of you. And so we wanted just a little bit of alcohol. We didn't want too much alcohol, but then also non-alcoholic beer could never quite match up in terms of flavor. Mm-hmm. It was always lacking. And this is very much down to the process. You end up, if you're removing alcohol, you end up stripping out flavor, either through reverse osmosis or through distillation. Distillates are beautiful. There's this amazing thing in nature where when you distill a spirit, you actually end up, the distillate just happens to be the most, this most wonderful concoction of all the wonderful things that you've put into the still. You get all the floral aromas, the citrusy aromas, all those amazing, that combination of all of the best things. If you try what's left in the still, the kind of the dregs, the bottoms that are left in the still, they are all the things that you don't really want to be tasting. Now, when you're making non-alcoholic beer, if you distill the alcohol off, what you're left with in the still is your non-alcoholic beer. All the wonders, all the most delicate, fantastic flavors that come from hops, for example, are all incredibly volatile. And this is why, if you don't drink beer fresh, if you leave it for a year or two before you drink it, you lose a lot of those fresh aromas. And freshness is something that is important in beer. And so there are some beers that can age, and they develop more sort of sherry or brandy characteristics. But with that experience of just sitting back and having a great beer after work, I think it's got to be a refreshing one. And you lose all those fresh flavors into your distillate, effectively. So you end up with this amazing beer spirit that nobody ever drinks. But what you are drinking is the kind of non-alcoholic stuff that's left behind, which is just not that fun.
Well, I assume that wasn't all in the one chat over the beer.
No, no. The one chat over the beer was was just this. It was a frustration. It was kind of, how is it possible that nobody is making a 2 or 3% beer? Something that we can just drink, and actually, it's not going to get us drunk. We're not going to get in trouble in all these other parts of our lives, and yet we can still enjoy the experience.
Was that the eureka moment when you looked at each other and said, "Let's try"?
It was. I mean, looking back on it, I think, romantically speaking, yes, that could have been the eureka moment. At the time, it was just a casual throwaway comment, but it was also, it was kind of, oh, there's a gap in the market. Why is nobody doing this? Well, I think on a daily basis, when you have an entrepreneurial mind, you spot 100 of these things every day, and yet it takes something to be able to jump at it. And it took us many, many months, I think, before we realized that actually we had to be the ones to set this up. We strongly believed at the time that there probably was something else out there. We just haven't found it yet. And so we did a lot of research to find out, why is there no lower strength beer that's not non-alcoholic beer, that's not your kind of classic beer of 4 or 5%. And then that was when we really found out that there was this huge, very rich history of people drinking beer at 1 and 2%. And it was called small beer. And we kind of thought, well, I mean, surely we should be honoring small beer and its heritage by using that name, lending, small beer has lent us that name, we've borrowed it, and we can use that to sort of address this new category within the drinks industry.
Now,
an entirely new a new beer.
Sorry, when you say they were drinking it, you're talking 18th century, so you must have done a lot of digging.
Well, it was. It's an interesting one. So the small beer is actually referenced a number of times in the literature. So you find it in Shakespeare, you find it in Chaucer, you find it in Dickens. But it is it's an interesting thing that it's managed to find its way into our culture, into our language. In quite an ironic way, actually. Small beer tends to mean, just the phrase, oh, it's just small beer, means something that's sort of, not of great importance.
I've never heard that.
Yeah, and so that was almost, sort of a tongue-in-cheek, we're kind of referencing this, oh, well, it's this new concept. I mean, it's only a completely new category of drinks, but hey, it's just small beer. But also we knew that what we were creating was actually something of significance and was quite special. So, but at the same time, I think certainly in London or in England as a whole, there's an understanding that of what small beer was. People know, for example, that before water was potable, people used to drink beer. What they don't necessarily always understand is that beer wasn't 4 or 5%. And so there's this kind of belief that maybe everybody was just walking around completely drunk all the time. Well, that probably wasn't the case. I mean, certainly there probably were some people who were walking around drunk all the time, but actually our culture revolved around drinking small beer in the daytime. So literally everybody from school children right through to high society, they were drinking small beer for hydration, but also for nutrition. And so small beer contained all these nutrients that you were getting from the grain, from the barley that goes into the beer. And so you're getting B vitamins, you're getting iron, you're getting zinc, you're getting magnesium, selenium. Selenium's this kind of wonder drug that, actually people are taking selenium supplements now because it improves brain function.
Yes, you're supposed to eat 2 Brazil nuts a day.
There you go.
For
exactly.
selenium.
So, there's no need to go into the Brazilian rainforest to find your nutrition. It's right in front of you. Why don't you just drink some small beer? So there are all these benefits of drinking small beer. But then on the weekends and in the evenings, people would have had their stronger beer. And actually, small beer was never something that was made commercially. It was made in the home, and it would have been a recipe or a process that was passed down from generation to generation. And so we don't actually find, there aren't really many records
or
of
recipes,
small beer
I guess,
being made. Exactly. And so there's one famous one that George Washington had his own recipe for making small beer. He had a particularly sweet tooth, so it contains lots of molasses and sugar. But small beer tended to be something that was made almost as a means of or a measure of frugality, and so it was made at home, and it was often made as an end result or a byproduct of making bigger beer. So you would be brewing beer for your weekend moments or your evening moments, sort of the kind of 4-5% variety, and then you would reboil your mash. You would add in more water, and you'd boil up again, almost like taking the second runnings from tea leaves or coffee. So you're getting this weaker, more tannic beer. So it certainly wouldn't have tasted anything like the beer that we make today at Small Beer. And I think in part this is probably why it's not referenced so much in the literature. It was this kind of necessity that you just drank small beer because you had to, because that's what it was safe to drink. It was it would provide you with the things that you needed, but you didn't necessarily. It wasn't revered as this kind of wonder concoction. It was a little bit like sort of a porridge or a gruel, or something.
That's kind of how I see it.
It was a staple of life. And staples don't often, they're not often revered, and yet they are so important to our lives. And actually, sometimes, you want nothing more than to eat a bowl of porridge or a baked potato or some plain pasta, and it is just a beautiful thing. And I think sometimes, we go so far with food, and then sometimes we just want to come back to what we know and what reminds us of our past and our childhood, and that is also very much the position that we've taken with beer. I think the craft brewing industry has given us all these crazy mad beers that absolutely are there to excite the senses, but sometimes also massively overpower the senses. That experience that we wanted to capture was just that one of having a beautifully crisp, clean lager, having a wonderful, simple pale ale with these kind of fantastic hoppy aromas, having this rich, dark chocolate and coffee note that you get with the dark lager, and having that kind of just the kind of robustness and the complexity that you get from the steam that we produce. So those 4 styles that we brew today, they're all very simple renditions of very classic beer styles. We're not going out there to completely destroy people's palates, which I think has just happened far too much in recent years. But anyway, that sort of but this is all rooted in history. And yet what we do is we make small beer, it's rooted in history, but it's made for today.
Now, after doing all of this research and putting it into practice, that's two different things.
Totally,
right?
Absolutely.
So you thought you're onto something.
Yeah.
We're sitting right here in the beautiful distillery.
Yeah.
How long did this take, and what was the process to get it up and running?
And this is a brewery, by the way.
Oh, sorry. Oh, sorry.
No. I
have to keep that in.
I thought you were putting me back in.
No. Sorry, we're sitting in a beautiful brewery.
Please don't take me back to the distillery.
No.
Anything.
We're talking only about small beer from here on in. No, we're sitting here in this beautiful brewery. Trying to make small beer.
Absolutely.
Is it the same process?
It is. It's quite a different process, and it was a process that there wasn't any prescriptive way of making small beer. In fact, the recipes and the processes, as I say, were very much, didn't really exist in the literature. The recipes that we can see tell us that it was pretty much a given that small beer was probably made around the kind of 1 or 2% mark in alcohol. And in fact, there's a very good reason for that, and that is that around the 3% mark, so about 2.8% alcohol, you get this natural break, which is called the diuretic limit. So anything that you're drinking below 3% is, as you drink it, it hydrates you. Anything that you drink above 3% alcohol dehydrates you. And so this is why you're always told as a child, well, when you start drinking wine, you should always drink water, a glass of wine, follow it up with water. Mm-hmm. Who really does that? I don't think anybody does. And then you wake up first thing in the morning with a massive headache and you think, God, if only I'd have had a pint of water before I went to bed. Small beer allows you to have all that fun, to have the experience, and yet you wake up with a clear head. And that is the number one reason why it's just that you're not dehydrating as you drink. There's also, you're not putting quite as much alcohol into your system, and so your body can break down the alcohol as you're drinking, rather than it building up into this sort of massive toxic mess. But the beauty is that you're hydrating as you drink, and this is why it was important for our culture. It was important as a means of hydration. But so for us, from there, we kind of, yes, we had this very sort of the beginnings of an idea, but we were also running our day jobs, right? And our families. So we had this, we were living this very, very fast-paced lifestyle. And yet we found the time on weekends, we started brewing. So luckily, I built up my brewing kit. This was sort of, I guess, 12 years into my, 10 or 12 years into my brewing career and my experience of brewing. So I built up my brewing kit by that stage into a sort of dedicated brewery at the end of my garden. And so we started brewing pretty much every weekend, developing the recipes and the processes. And the process is so important for us, actually, because the recipe alone, actually, if you look at our recipe today for making small beer, if any brewer walked in off the street and saw our recipe, they would say, yeah, that's a classic recipe for a beer of around the kind of 4 to 5% mark. So it doesn't show that we're making small beer from the recipe. We actually use the same amount of ingredients as you would do to make a much bigger beer, which seems kind of wasteful. Mm-hmm. Well, you're not getting much alcohol out of it. So why are you losing so much alcohol? Well, we don't. So what we do is rather than focusing on alcohol creation, which has been the kind of the thought process of brewers for hundreds of years, has all been brewers' efficiency. So brewers' efficiency, simply put, is trying to get as much alcohol as possible out of a certain amount of raw material. So in this case, malted barley. So you're taking the malted barley, you want to extract as much fermentable sugar from that barley as possible to convert into as much alcohol as possible. And that's what gives us, the Budweisers of this world. So that's what gives you these amazing feats of engineering where you get this, these breweries can churn out this very alcoholic beer that tastes of very, very little. What we've done is the exact opposite of that. So we're getting as much flavor from the raw materials as possible, whilst maintaining a controlled level of alcohol. And so that's what we realized very early on, was actually we needed lots of ingredients because we still wanted that same amount of flavor. Mm-hmm. And flavor doesn't come from nowhere. You have to put something in to get it. So we started brewing down at the end of the garden, developing the recipe, developing the process, but then also at the same time developing a bit of a business plan, because we kind of thought, this might, something might come of this, and at some stage, if we really want to make this a reality, we're going to need a business plan. We're going to need to think about how we want to scale this up, and where we might be able to get some investment. We realized very early on that actually to sustain this idea of small beer, we couldn't just release it as a tiny little brewery and grow organically, because I think we were aware of now thinking 4 or 5 years later, we now have really seen this huge shift in consumer mentality. People now are so much more aware of their health. They're looking for vegan products, they're looking for gluten-free products, they're looking for low-calorie products, they're looking for low-alcohol products. Well, small beer ticks all 4 of those boxes. And sustainable, absolutely. Right. Yeah. And
so you tick all 5.
Oh, 5 of those boxes, absolutely. I mean, there are certainly more boxes to tick than that. I mean, I've mentioned selenium as one of them. But there are so many. The selenium box. there are so many benefits. This is the problem: is that in some ways, in order to now understand how to tell the world about our product, we can't just go out there and tell them 100 great things about small beer. No one's going to sit there and read that or listen to you say that. Hopefully your listeners will still be listening by this stage. Are you still listening? But no, there are so many fantastic benefits, and it's just a case of kind of understanding really how we can tap into people's minds and just get them to understand that actually it's just about having a great beer. It's fantastic tasting beer. That is the number one thing. Oh, and it happens to just be a little bit lower in alcohol, so that means that you can wake up tomorrow morning with a clear head. That's enough. Because as soon as you tell somebody that you're making a product that is low in alcohol, low in calories, they just immediately assume that it's going to taste terrible. And they think it's going to be dull and watery, and that is just the absolute opposite of what we are doing. And so that came to us very early on. We were realizing that actually there was a big shift in the kind of consumer mentality in the marketplace. People were really opening up to this idea of small beer, and it wasn't going to be such a big jump for them to kind of actually understand why they should be drinking small beer and why actually it could become part of everyday life again. I think, for 100 years we've sort of lost the idea of small beer simply because we kind of thought, well, drinking quality, the quality of drinking water is good. We can drink water now. We can drink Coca-Cola. We can drink all these fantastic things that we've just created in the last 100 years from nothing. And yet, I strongly believe that we were actually doing the right thing 100 years ago. So now it's sort of finding the way back in to sort of get that back into our lives. Beer gives us something that so many of those other drinks don't give you. It's not giving you tons of calories and caffeine and all this stuff. It is giving you pure refreshment. And I think you get refreshment from beer in a way that you get from no other liquid. It has such a strong, powerful effect in giving you that kind of amazing experience of just, I remember moving to New York. We stayed for the first couple of months on Times Square in this building that had, the air conditioning was terrible. And it was the summer of 2005. 2003, and it reached 100 degrees in New York. It was absolutely stinking hot, and it was just so crowded. And I just remember getting back to the apartment, and my mother opened up the fridge door and handed me a bottle of Beck's at the time as it happened. But that experience of refreshment that I got just in that moment of kind of listening to that cap just opening up, and then just having that first sip of beer, and you're just like, wow, this is incredible. So anyway, so we got to the stage where we'd set up this business plan, and we kind of thought, to begin with, it was almost a bit of a joke. Was this really going to happen? And every day, with more brewing and more research and more, developing this idea, all of a sudden it was becoming more and more of a reality. And at some stage, we kind of thought, well, yeah, we're going to have to make this jump. And actually, maybe we're going to have to start telling people about it. It might be something that spreads beyond just us. We were keeping this terrible secret, and it was making me feel almost guilty. You've kept this incredible thing to yourself. I mean, my neighbors are saying to me, my neighbors who know me as the guy who smokes salmon in the house and then puts up salted salmon fillets on the washing line and hoses them down, and they say, "What are you doing?" And I say, "Well, it's a long story." All of a sudden, I'm brewing beer literally on a weekly basis, and they're going, "What are you doing? What's the next project? What's this all about?" Well, I can't really tell you. Well, can we taste it? No. And it was just this horrible experience of keeping this secret. One that I can only really sort of compare with the experience of knowing that you're about to propose to your wife to be. The only other secret that I've really kept in my entire life for a couple of months, and that was horrible as it was. But this was going on and on and on. Finally, we decided that we had to tell Sam and Fairfax, the founders of Sipsmith. So I met James working at Sipsmith. Mm-hmm. He was the head of sales. I was the head of operations. He had been there from day one. He'd grown up with the business. He understood how they'd grown to that level. And in fact, he was responsible for their growth. I mean, he was out there burning through shoe leather on a daily basis, speaking to every single bartender, every hotelier, every single person on the streets of London, telling them the virtues of Sipsmith gin. And I saw such a passion in this man. And I still, I revere him. I think he's such a fantastic person to work with. But at the same time, he was also putting a lot of trust in me at the time. It was kind of, well, I'm really relying on you to come up with this process, with this product. He himself didn't have the experience of brewing, or the knowledge or the understanding. And so it was this kind of this wonderful mix of the two. We're so different as people. I'm very much more sort of process driven, and I like to sit back and think about things, and I like to really, make things perfect. That's kind of the fundamental way in which I work. James is just so passionate and so full of fire, and he just runs at the speed of lightning. And so we just worked so well together. And I think, initially I think we were both thinking, how are we ever going to work together and make this reality? But it has been an incredible few years of really, of partnership, and long may it continue. So that was a couple of years really in the making, until the day where we handed in our notices. We worked out our notices at Sipsmith whilst really progressing very, very quickly with the build. So I had designed the entire brewery. So the brewing kit was all my design. I designed it to make small beer and small beer alone. It was never really going to make anything else other than small beer, and it still hasn't got the capability to do that. It is specifically designed around making small beer. We could use it maybe to make a 4 or 5% beer, but it would be like using the wrong screwdriver for the screw. It was, it is so finely tuned to make small beer, to make beer around the kind of 2% mark. And I think in that lies a huge amount of, in that lies our potential as a business to expand and to stay true to what we do. So there are other breweries now that we're aware of that started out making 5 and 6% beers. They've ventured into the kind of 3% territory, and those 3% beers taste nowhere near as good as our 2% beer. And that just makes me, it makes me glad, but also I'd like for there to be some other small beer, because at the end of the day, we didn't make this stuff because we thought, there's a gap in the market, let's monetize it. We made small beer because we ourselves needed it. We wanted it to be a part of our lives. And so we would only be encouraged if other people were to join us in this space, in this new category, to create their own small beers. That's why, we called our small beer the original small beer, is because, we're the first ones here to do it. But if there are others, forcing us on and actually becoming our competitors, that will only spur us on. But also, we can have a family of small beers, and then maybe we could drink something else other than just our own beer all the time. So, anyway, so a couple of years on, we got the keys to this place. It was a warehouse, and it had a cracked concrete floor, a leaking roof. It was not the place that we had sort of quite envisaged to make small beer, but it also had these beautiful skylights, this big open space. I mean, we were knocking around in here, 2 guys, incredibly excited, but also, I think at the time we had no idea really what we were doing. But we had this phenomenal design that was in with the manufacturer, and we'd placed our deposit for the brewery. So November 2017, the brewing kit arrived. That all went in. We had 2 months of welding, of getting everything into place. I designed the brewery as a kind of 2D, almost like a tube map, and getting it all in and actually working out how it would work in 3D was a huge task, a huge feat of the mind. And but we got there in the end, and we've been brewing now and developing and continuing to develop. We actually run a laboratory here where we have reduced our batch sizes. So on a large scale, we're brewing batches of 5,000 litres of beer in a single day. We've reduced our batch size on the development kit down to 250 millilitres, so that we can produce as many of those as possible, so that we know actually how we can develop the beer and how we can make it even better. So that's where we are today in terms of the process, but we're also we're available now in the entire country. I mean, as far as, so we're in every single Majestic wine store in the country. We are just about to launch onto Ocado. We sell through our own website. So very early days when we first launched into the market, we were taken up by, in fact, our very first customer was the Savoy in London. And so, and they at the time had just won World's Best Bar. They really took on small beer as this incredible new innovation, and I think they've looked after us along the way, and they support us so well. But that led to, the Wolseley, the Connaught, Dorchester. I mean, there are so many fantastic places in London that have really heralded small beer. And then that led on to the Old Vic, and the National Theatre, the Royal Festival Hall, all these cultural spaces where you go and you want a beer, but then you don't want to be falling asleep during the show. And so that's really sort of given us a real boost up. But I think we don't want small beer to be an exclusive beer. We want beer to be, small beer to be available to everybody. we want to make it part of our culture, our history, and sort of bring it back so that everybody can enjoy it. That's the key.
Well, you've made me so thirsty.
Should we go and have a beer?
Let's go have a beer. Thanks so much to Felix for inviting me to the Small Beer Brew Company's headquarters in London. Since we're talking beer here, there is no cocktail of the week, but Felix did get a chance to describe their beer selection to me in depth.
So we produce a beautiful classic Pilsner style lager. It is clean, it's crisp, it's refreshing. It has this fantastic floral continental aroma, which comes from the Saaz hops. So these are hops that are grown in the Czech Republic, and they are the defining character of the Pilsner style. This beer is here to, it's to refresh you. It pairs beautifully with food, particularly with fish dishes, but it is just the ultimate refreshment. I was never a huge lager drinker before Small Beer, and now it is, it's my number one beer. I drink it most days. Then we have the second in our range. We actually launched with this one as well, was our dark lager. Now, dark lager is really not a style that you find in the UK so much at all. We have a wonderful tradition of dark beers, and in fact, in London 100 to 150 years ago, dark beer was pretty much all the beer that you could buy was dark. And I'm talking sort of black in colour. So we're looking at porters, stouts, milds, but a dark lager was not something that was on the agenda back then. It is a style that you will find on the continent, although these ones will be much thicker, much meatier. We produce a dark lager which is clean, it's crisp. You can drink it on a hot summer's day. It is beautifully refreshing, and yet it has all of those flavours that you get from a dark beer. So from the darker malts, you're getting chocolate, coffee, toast, these kind of nutty flavours, and then just a little wisp of smoke that just leads you in for a little bit more. It's beautifully velvety and luxurious, and yet it's not heavy. It's not a stout. It's much cleaner than that. And that's certainly, it's always been my favourite style of beer, and I insisted that when we start brewing Small Beer, we must have a dark lager on the menu. That one is only 1% in alcohol. Then last summer we launched a fantastic beer. This one was very much led by James and his love for the steam style of beer. So steam beer is a style that actually existed. It was first created in Germany in the mid 1800s. It's a beer style that is complex. So we make it with rye, wheat, barley, and oats. So it has a real complexity of flavour. It has a lot of dimensions as you drink it, and yet we also then balance that complexity with these American hops, Chinook, that gives you this sort of this grapefruit aroma, this kind of zesty, fresh flavour, and it's a beautiful, beautiful beer. It's a rich red rye colour, and it goes down very, very well with meat dishes. And then finally, this summer, we've actually just launched Session Pale. So Session Pale is the fourth in our range. It is 2.5% in alcohol, and it is absolutely incredible when you first go in to taste Session Pale. You'll get all these beautiful hoppy aromas, all these sort of tropical fruit notes, citrus fruits, but then also pineapple and passion fruit. But then that leads through to a roundness on the palate. It is an ale after all. We use an ale yeast to make it. It gets a slightly quicker fermentation. It's more lively. Has this beautiful thick white head, and it is it's this kind of wonderful balance of intense bitterness from the hops, but then also the sweetness. And then this wonderful round sensation in the mouth. So that's the 4 beers that we do.
Of course, if you are looking for any cocktail recipes, you can find all the cocktails of the week at alushlifemanual.com, where you'll also find all the ingredients in our shop. I was never a beer drinker, even in college. Then one day I found myself in Dusseldorf at a beer garden with a lager and a plate full of brown bread with schmaltz. And I have never tasted anything better in my life. If you live for Lush Life, would you consider supporting us by buying us a coffee? Just go to buymeacoffee.com/lushlife, and you can donate once or monthly to make sure we are still here every Tuesday. Also, you know how much I love to talk about cocktails, and we can all be together talking on the flick.group/lushlife app. It's free to join and works on Android or iOS devices. Plus, you can listen to the latest episodes right there if you want to catch up. Theme music for Lush Life is by Steven Shapiro and used with permission. And Lush Life is always and will forever be produced by Evo Terra and Simpler Media Productions. Which leaves me to say the wise words of Oscar Wilde: all things in moderation, including moderation, and always drink responsibly. Okay, the second part was mine. Up and coming on Lush Life, we have a distiller who fell in love with rum at first sip. But how could she make it in the Colorado mountains? Until next time, bottoms up.